Professor Michael Banissy. There are so many people I've been mentioning you to. I kind of feel I got to know you a little bit. In any event, I devoured your book, When We Touch: Handshakes, Hugs, High Fives, and the New Science of Why Touch Matters, published by Hachette. And we're going to get into the US edition. But in your own words, Michael, who are you?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Michael Banissy. I suppose professionally, I'm a psychologist. I'm the head of psychology at the University of Bristol. But I suppose what took me into that route is I'm very much a people watcher. I've been fascinated by people my whole lives, the relationships we have with each other, how we form them, how we build them, how we maintain them. And a big part of that is touch, and that's very much been at the heart of my research for several years now, well over a decade. And yeah, it all kind of comes back to that whole big question for me of how is it that people we're messy as people, right? We all have all these things we bring to our lives. How do we come together and build and maintain social relationships, and what plays a role in that, and when can it be positive, when can it be negative? That's what my work's all about, really.
Well, when you say you're a psychologist and you observe people, I'm thinking that's more like a sociologist.
Yeah, true. So my background is in social neuroscience. So I've always historically studied the brain basis of social interaction. So what happens in our brain when we interact with others. So I do a lot of
Dopamine and all the other things that are going on.
exactly, all of those kind of components. And so I do lab-based work, but I also do things like survey-based work. I do behavioral studies. So we might bring people into the lab and measure things like their empathy and how empathic they are towards one another, which of course is a really hard thing to do, because how do you measure empathy? But that's probably a different topic.
And has me interested dead on.
So we do more observational work. So we've done studies where we've just been out watching how people interact on campus, two people, whether they hug each other, whether they don't hug each other, those types of interactions. So we're very much a mixed methods approach in my lab. It's this blend of neuroscience, psychology, to a degree, some sociology as well in there. I kind of think often the key is, what's the question? And then you think about how best to answer that question. I don't think there's ever one perfect method, right? You want mixed methods that converge together on a common answer, then hopefully you're getting to the right answer. But it's never quite that simple, of course.
It seems like it's a perfect reflection of the messiness of our being.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of the things about studying people, is you quickly recognize that it's not like physics where things are nice, linear, easy formulas, right? People are hard and messy, and they bring nuance and they bring variance. And one of the big trends that I've really valued over the last, I suppose, 5-10 years or so in psychology is a much greater focus on that nuance. Previously there was a lot of work talking about, okay, well, people show this and the average response, but now recognizing that kind of nuance in between, those kind of fine lines that come between us and play a role from one person to the other.
In the realm of straight talk, nuance and average doesn't really sell well.
No.
And if you're publishing papers and trying to get a name and a notoriety, have we lost the ability to be black or white?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because I think there's headlines obviously grab, and headlines obviously do sell, right? But I think actually recognizing, I suppose, the diversity around the headline, I do think is actually becoming increasingly more well understood and well recognized. I think increasingly we are trying to see more spaces where we can get our differences and our perspectives out there, whether people always agree with one another, and people may well fall into camps on that. But I do think that is now recognized as a pretty good approach to try to, if you don't share and understand those differences begin to grow, right? So it's about how can we create those spaces. And the good thing in research is I think people are getting that across, and I think people are beginning to share that more broadly as well.
I want to get into your book afterwards, but just another question with regard to your work. So I'm imagining you're teaching classes. Is that still something you do?
Yeah. So I do some teaching. So in Bristol, I'm the head of psychology. So I effectively I kind of oversee all of our operations. It's a kind of, I suppose in a business world, it's a bit like acting like a mini CEO, some people say, because you've
The
got,
dean.
yeah, you've got a good kind of 110 FTE staff, and you've got obviously about 1,000 students coming through your doors. So it's a whole range of people and dynamics to think about. But in that, yeah, I do teaching as well. So I teach around things like social neuroscience and social interaction. That's mainly where I do my work. I supervise students. We run experimental projects together, and I kind of supervise their work. And that's from all levels, right? That's undergraduate right the way through to PhD, and then I have staff that work with me as researchers in my lab, in my team. So it's a very varied role, effectively.
Mm. And my question that I wanted to ask about your teaching was, to what extent teaching has changed over the years for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always changing, to be fair. I think increasingly there's been changes in methods. I guess when I was coming through the system, it was very much a kind of chalk and talk style. People would stand up, give the lecture. I remember actually being in a lecture where I think a professor literally read from a book to me, and I was quite disappointed about that. I was like, well, I could read this at home. So it is, yeah, that increase on much more interactive components, but small group, large group, getting those blends. And I think an increasing recognition over the years about how we can make teaching, I suppose, more inclusive as well and more accessible, because that can come from a variety of different ways to assess students. I mean, historically, teaching has been sometimes about the kind of one big exam at the end of the year kind of thing, which obviously plays to some people's strengths, but more and more now it's kind of blending with multiple assessments, different types of assessments, maybe doing a podcast rather than writing an essay, all of these different kind of things. So there's getting a much more diversity in it, and an understanding. And I guess now, as we move forward, a big thing for us that we're now very much thinking about in teaching is, of course, the rise of AI, which I know is another topic that will probably pique your interest. But of course, how do you engage with teaching or assessment with AI in the world? And so it's continually moving, and I think that's quite exciting.
Yeah, ChatGPT and the like. My subplot or sub question really is around the place for debate, a
Yeah.
lively conversation. So if I flash back to my generation, we would have frolicking, very lively debate,
Yep.
where it felt like it was free roam.
Mm-hmm.
What I am gaining or garnering from reports and media is that it doesn't seem to be quite as lively, the debate. It's more tempered, maybe more nuanced, but also one could also say it's more closed.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it that way. I mean, I think it also depends on where in the world you're looking at as well, right? So I think a lot of those headlines about very kind of closed debate, often people connect to some of the things, particularly in North America and some of those kind of areas there. I mean, I think my experience of it on the ground is, I think there's still very much open debate. I mean, I think it's in the UK at least, I think it's there. I think it's about ensuring that those debates are, I suppose, structured in such a way that everybody involved can feel comfortable to be heard and to be listened, and get their voices across and perspectives that are respectful to one another, right? And I think it's about how you set those kind of boundaries in that space, about respectfully listening and disagreeing, and what that means. And of course, there's a fine line in that, because if something quickly moves to being offensive or problematic, then we've got to be very cautious, to prevent that. But I think a lot of that can often be set by setting the parameters of conversation, and almost, it's not so much the rules of engagement, but it's about just getting the right culture and ethos around that. But I wouldn't say that there is no debate in the education setting. I think debate is there. It's still an active part. It's just, yeah, I suppose you never know what it was when you weren't there, I suppose. So I can't make those comparisons to that time. But I do recognize increasingly there is a concern about, yeah, is debate getting, I suppose, tempered down, watered down? And I think, yeah, certainly from what I've seen, not necessarily so, but that's not to say, that is the case. I mean, I've worked at some very lively places. I was at Goldsmiths in the University of London before moving across, and Goldsmiths is known for being very much a kind of, I suppose, free speech and a climate of challenge and, you know, different views and perspectives. And I think certainly there was a lot of lively debate and activity there as well when I was there. And I see that now at Bristol as well. So
I'm glad to hear. Alexandra, my daughter, who attended Bristol, I know that she's a fiery, passionate individual and surely had plenty of good conversations. I think one of the advantages of my schooling in Britain was that I learned to think on my feet and argue. But I also played rugby, so I was able to back myself up with some sort of physical presence. I think that also helps sometimes when you're being thrust into a lively debate.
for
So
sure.
it can be, it's not physical fights, but physical in terms of mental acuity,
Yeah, I think
body
it's
posture.
that ability to kind of think on your feet and respond, and yeah, that kind of strength of mind in it as well, right?
Right. So we just mentioned North America and how a little bit different it is. You wrote the book When We Touch for Hachette for the European version, and to my great surprise, the title was quite different, or at least that's the way I approached it. The title in the US, or published by Chronicle Prism, was, instead of When We Touch, Handshakes, Hugs, High Fives, and so on, it was Touch Matters, Handshakes, Hugs, and the New Science on How Touch Can Enhance Your Well-Being. Okay, so tell us about that change, how you were or not involved in it, and how much of the text had to be changed other than just OUR to OR.
Yeah, so the story of the book was, it very much started off with the UK version. That was the version that we sold the rights to begin with. And When We Touch was always the original title. That was the title from book proposal right the way through to the publication. And yeah, partway through the process, it was just after, it was quite early on, just after the first draft was submitted. We brought the US publisher, you know, they came on board, and yeah, I think in the process they were like, well, actually, you know, starting to read this, we kind of think actually the more directness of the title, Touch Matters, for them, they thought that their audiences, their market may well just connect better with that, more so than When We Touch. I think the reason for When We Touch is, as you know, the book has got a lot about human contact, right? Human touch. So we wanted to get that when we touch, that kind of we coming together. But on the flip side of it, I suppose there is a broad message throughout the whole book, right, about the fact that touch is actually a really important part of our lives. And, you know, so I think going more direct with Touch Matters does get that out there, and that's part of the messaging. And of course, it was checked with me of would I feel comfortable with the change in title? How did I feel about it? And I was quite, you know, I was quite happy with it. I was open to the idea of having it. I mean, I think yeah, for me, there's also an interesting part in that, because there's Touch Matters in terms of the directness, but of course the book is all about, I suppose, the different matters of touch, and you could interpret it in that way. So I quite like the title as well in that context.
What about the content itself? Were there any major edits that were involved?
Yeah, largely the content's very, I mean, it's very similar between the two books actually, and I think that was also partly because, you know, throughout the editorial process, we had both the UK and the US editor working at the same time as we were developing it. So, you know, it was very interesting to kind of get the different feedback for what each, I suppose, audience and market might be interested in. And I think we tried to strike that balance as we were going through, making sure, you know, kind of balance of take-home messages and how you can maybe apply things in your life and things like this, which certainly was a key focus for the North American market. That was a key part to that, which we were keen to bring in. So it kind of came in throughout the development of the book rather than the final version, because people were in so early. You know, I think if it was one of those things where the book had been published in the UK and then there was lead time before the US version, maybe more things might have changed. But actually, because both publishers were on board quite early on in the process, so shortly after the first main draft, it actually meant that we started to work that way. Obviously, work for me as an author to make the edits, and you know, even a small change, as I'm sure you'll know, right? Even a small change in one chapter has a knock-on effect somewhere else. So it's quite a time-consuming process to make all those different dynamics. But in my case, it worked well having both the UK and the US editor, because it it gave me a diversity of perspective on it, right? Which was
Right.
useful, actually, just to think about it. Like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Or, you know, yeah, certainly some of the components where you're talking about one element and might get changed because maybe it won't quite work so well. That'd be like in one of the chapters we talk a bit about workplace touch, and actually I recall in some of the early drafts I was tying in some of the work around politics at the time, particularly in the US, because there'd been a lot of conversations about obviously Trump and Biden and these kind of dynamics, which in the end we opted to go about it in a very different way because, you know, it probably wasn't adding sufficient value to the book to have that debate in there. And of course, it's quite a polarizing debate, I suppose, if you're pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. So there's balances to be struck that you sometimes have to do as you go.
Well, the concept of politics of touch is something that I ran into for sure, but probably not in a sort of democratic Republican kind of way, more in a general human politics, maybe small p, in the way what it reveals and the messaging that we're doing through the touch. So that was right. I came at it from this. So let's start. I mean, we're not starting, but at this point, tell us, Michael, about your journey into touch, because obviously things like Me Too and the pandemic brought touch to the fore, but you've been studying it, and I'd love you, as you describe in the book, the how, why touch.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey because I suppose I link it back to that fact I'm interested in how people interact, how they form, make bonds, make relationships through their lives. How do they last, and how do we maintain them? And one of the things that I found to a degree frustrating when I first started out in psychology was I was reading lots of research and so much on vision as a sense to our emotions, to our ability to socially interact, which makes perfect sense. We rely on it all the time, but there was a real lack of research around some of the other senses, and particularly touch. And for me, I was like, well, that's really surprising because touch is one of the first senses that we develop. You know, we are responding often to touch even in the third trimester, right? During pregnancy, there's evidence that the babies will, fetuses will respond, you know, with tactile exploration. So it's there really early on, and you know, certainly from the first moments of our lives, we can often use touch to build those bonds with our caregivers, right? That are really important. But it's also there right the way until the end of life. I mean, affective touch, and this is something that in science we refer to as those kind of, I suppose, emotionally supportive touches, you know, those kinds of comforting touches. Our sensitivity to that is present right the way through until our late 90s. You know, it could go for longer. It's just that's only how far the data's gone to, right? So from the first moment of life right the way through to the end, touch is with us. It's a really important part of our social relationships. But what I was somewhat disappointed in very early on was, where's the research on it? And it was somewhat missing. It was a missing piece. And in a strange way, actually, despite that frustration, I didn't start off studying touch. I started off studying empathy, funnily enough. And one of the interesting things about empathy that when I was working on it was that we were studying the brain systems that are involved in empathy, and we kept seeing a certain set of brain regions that were becoming active when people were observing other people experiencing sensations, right, experiencing states. And often they involved the somatosensory system or somatosensory related cortices. And these are parts of the brain that are involved in experiencing touch. So there was something about sharing someone else's state and these tactile systems that were playing a role. And so these tactile systems, part of the reason people think they become involved in empathy is because they think, well, when you see someone feeling a state, you almost kind of imagine what it might be like to feel that state yourself, right? You might map it on to your own experiences, those own tactile experiences. But to cut a long story short, because I'm not here to talk about empathy, right? But that brought the somatosensory system and touch back into my research, which made me dig more into it. And in that sense, I started to dig deeper and deeper and start just to look at touch on its own as a sense. How does it work? How do we use it to share interactions with one another? And this then led to, big projects, ranging from studies in the lab to a big project with the BBC that we ran around lockdown, around 2020, not knowing lockdown was coming, of course.
Right. That was a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. Just to kind of explore what touch means in the world today, and how important is it to things like our health and our well-being, and so forth.
I certainly want to get into that. Just observation, you said, there's a lot about the eyes with relationship, but I mean, I have to imagine there's also a lot about hearing
Yeah.
and the tone of voice. My wife constantly talks about the sense of smell and how those pheromones are vital as for her.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's also, I mean, it's very easy in our conversation now. We keep talking about touch, right? Obviously, nature of the conversation, but I think with all the senses, we have to keep in mind that the world we experience around us isn't just a single sense, right? It's a combination a lot of the time of those senses, and so someone's smell can impact how you respond to their touch. It can impact, let's say what you hear could impact based on what you see, right? There's all these dynamics where our senses are interacting. We experience them as one unitary whole. It just happens that in science, we tend to study them more and more in isolation. But that kind of multi-sensory world is vital to our world in general, and of course our social worlds.
So my gut says Michael Banissy is going through his early days, and all of a sudden he discovers that there's no bloody science of touch. Really, there's not enough data. Oh, this is a gold mine. I'm thinking at some level it has to be exciting to have discovered.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you land on something that is new and you can do that work, it's incredibly exciting because you're at the forefront of doing research on it, right? And actually, and you get to start working with very interesting people, around the world, collaborating on it. But
Because
also,
you're pioneering.
yeah, and also people who you work with in research, because one of the key parts of my research is that we've often worked with people who have very unusual experiences. So people that might just experience the world very differently, just for a subtle change in how their brains developed. And one group, that we worked with very early on were people who feel touch on their own body when they see touch to other people. So they're going back to this idea of empathy and touch, right? These people literally are sharing the sensations of other people. And working with those people and pioneering that and learning from them was a fascinating thing, because in moments of that, things that nobody else in the world knows, right? You've got those first snippets, and of course you've got to then go through the very boring academic process of publishing and getting all that out there. And, sometimes that's the less fun part. The fun part is being at the heart of the discovery, right?
Right, but it can also be exciting because you are pioneering, you're pushing an area publicly.
Oh, absolutely. And I think once I think it's the dynamics of, so for context, academic publishing, like going through the peer review process, it's quite a slow process. But I think once you get it out there,
too slow.
yeah, well, exactly. But once you get it out there, and then you can go and share it with everybody, with the public, with others, and that's brilliant, because then you start getting questions, right? You start getting questions you haven't thought about before. And my favorite audiences to speak to, most of them, it's not academic crowds. It's the public. It's people who I don't normally get to speak to in my days of work, because they ask me such clever questions that I don't often get through people who maybe think in that same kind of scientific way that I do, which of course, good questions do come from that as well. I don't want to knock my academic community, but actually the questions that can come from people who are looking at it, sometimes with the first time, sometimes with a very different lens, it just opens your mind to different possibilities with it. And that process is brilliant, and certainly one that's what keeps you going in research, really.
I have to imagine that some of those questions come from the mouths of a 7-year-old. Or
yeah, you do get that. I mean, I've one of the things I've done lots of, I suppose, public engagement with science throughout my career, and very early on I was doing events in schools and doing these kind of things where for Brain Awareness Week you go in and you get some great questions from these kids, things that do just make you think, wow, okay, hadn't thought about it that way, but that's a very honest take on that. Let's think about
unfiltered.
Exactly.
So You had talked about empathy before, and it's certainly obviously an area of interest for me. You are, I would say, it seems more focused on cognitive psychology, but you have obviously the exploration of many different types of science in a sense. In empathy, there's various schools that describe empathy. And let's say for me, I tend to categorize two types of empathy, one being cognitive, and then the other one affective. The funny other way of saying it, well, you can say emotional empathy, but you could also say feeling
Yeah.
empathy. And this is where there's like a crossover. And I've never thought of it, but touchy empathy or feeling as in touch empathy. Tell us what, if anything, is happening on that space, because it's really not something I know much about.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that idea of that kind of affective empathy, that emotional empathy, when you start looking neurologically about, what happens when somebody, I don't know, let's see somebody in pain, right? In that sense, how are they sharing that experience? Quite often, you will see people will recruit similar parts of the brain as when they
This is
physically.
the mirror neuron syndrome.
Sort of, yeah. So yeah. So I mean, you see it for pain, you see it for touch. People tend to just kind of co-represent, right? They tend to activate similar parts of the brain as when they experience that state themselves. And so some people do draw those comparisons and kind of say, well, there is that kind of feeling aspect of empathy coming in. So I think that can play out in that context. And certainly we've worked with people who literally say they feel a physical sensation of touch or a physical sensation of pain when they see somebody else experiencing it. So I don't know, if they saw somebody being slapped on the face, they would say they literally physically feel the sensation on their own face. And we've been able to show that these people behaviorally will differ to people that don't experience in this, so we can kind of verify their reports. We've also shown it neurologically, so they show different brain responses, but they just tend to, appear to be sharing these sensations, and those people then tend to show heightened affective empathy. So if you measure their affective empathy on tasks, whether they're questionnaires or whether they're computer-based tasks where we might know what the person was feeling and you're trying to see how much do they share it, you tend to see these people show heightened responses. They're more sensitive at detecting those types of cues. So there's a relationship to a degree between some of this, I suppose, what we might call somatosensory or tactile systems and our empathic responses. Exactly what that relationship is one that is very hard to disentangle. And I think that's one that people argue quite a lot about in the scientific sphere.
Well, all right. So, and certainly not to be politically correct, but it does make me think about pornography.
Mm.
You're watching someone else have sex, or watching triple X. Is that what's happening? I mean, are we talking about that sort of empathic feeling? I mean, is that a way of explaining that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So I mean, is it, and this comes back to the question of, is it empathy? Is it vicariously sharing? Is that the same as empathy? This comes back to the question, I think, of what is empathy, right? Is empathy the capacity to share the states of somebody else, or are there other components to it, like you allude to, like the cognitive thinking about what somebody might feel in
Yeah.
that situation? Or maybe it's about, not just sharing what we think the person is experiencing, but sharing what they're actually experiencing. Where does that break down, right? Because,
well, that's the difference between cognitive and affective. One is the feeling the feelings, and the other one is thinking I understand.
exactly, right. And so there's all these dynamics, which of course tie us back to this really thorny issue of, well, what is empathy to begin with, and
better a thorny issue than a horny issue.
for sure.
You mentioned earlier the idea of being in the womb and the touch that happens there. To what extent does the science show the amount of touch and the type of touch you have as a child preconditions your later life and your experience of touch as you go forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a really important part of our development. So there are studies that have looked quite sad studies, really, that looked at children who were sadly quite isolated during development, and that they didn't just lack touch. I should qualify this. They lacked a general kind of social interaction, and people have looked at how does that impact things like their cognitive development, how does it impact their social relationships, and you can see these negative impacts from not having, from really being touch deprived early on in life. You also see that in some of our non-human primate relatives. So people have done work in monkeys, for instance, where you see that if you separate monkeys from their mothers very early on, and you don't give them tactile interaction, they don't have that comforting touch, this can lead to all sorts of altered social behaviors, difficulties forming relationships, maintaining relationships as they age. There's another line of work as well, which has also looked at not necessarily touch deprivation, but just simply looks slightly more at, let's say you have a newborn human infant, and you have situations where, maybe, for instance, sadly, they can't have tactile interaction early on, but they can have some, but less than another. And people have then tracked how much does that touch in early life linked to later social skills. And there was a study that came out, it was only a couple of years ago now, which basically, this study looked at babies that were born kind of normal term, and had what they might call kind of typical tactile interaction with the caregiver, babies that were born preterm, so prematurely, and had some tactile interaction but not much, and then babies that were born preterm but had no tactile interaction. They tracked these kids for 20 years, and they looked at how much throughout those years, how much social synchrony, so how in sync they were when interacting with their caregivers. And they found that those that were touched very early on had more synchronous social interaction. And what they then went on to show was that even 20 years later, so when they were adults, if you put those kids, now adults, and you showed them somebody else experiencing an emotional state, and you looked at brain networks involved in empathy, you found those that had more touch and were more socially in sync with their parents as they aged, they showed more empathy towards others. So those very early moments of touch, even 20 years later, some kind of level of linkage being connected between them. So touch is really important from very early on.
And I really enjoyed the passages in your book about the preening and in the primates, how they observed that.
Oh, yeah.
What was going on in that. It's always been something fascinating. I want to get into, before we close, on what's happened over the last few years with the pandemic and such, but there's another area which is of interest to me, which is the touched and the touchy, the one touching, and to what extent touching is as or not useful, if you will, in stimulating the brain and the feelings.
Yeah, I mean, touch is an incredibly powerful social cue. And so I don't know, there's not necessarily a particular study that says, right, if you touch this amount, you'll see this much brain activity. We don't quite have that side of data to answer the question specifically. But what we do know is that for some of us, in some social situations, touch is actually our preferred nonverbal cue. So to express an emotion like sympathy, or to express an emotion like compassion and love, often historically people will opt to use touch as the method to convey that, right? Of course, there's context that matters in that. That's just if you're giving people free choice, right, where they feel quite comfortable, what will they use? One could imagine that maybe if you're in an environment that you don't feel comfortable in touching, some people might say the workplace, for example, then that person may not want to express sympathy through touching, right? So there's dynamics to that. But certainly touch is a really powerful cue, and it can have very subtle effects as well that we don't always realize. And I talk about this a bit in the book, right? So for instance, somebody simply placing an arm on your shoulder when they make a request to you, you can be more likely to comply with the request. So there's studies in bus drivers, for instance, showing, this was in France back in the 90s, I think, or early 2000s. And so they had people got on a bus and they didn't have enough money to pay for the ride. And so at that moment, either they touched the bus driver when they made the request or they didn't. And that simple act of touching the bus driver, that addition led to bus drivers being more likely to let them get on and have the free ride. And that's just one example. There's many of these scattered from the 1970s right the way through to even a year ago. There were studies coming out showing that even if someone touches you on the arm when you're giving you the bill, you might be more likely to give them a bigger tip or spend more money in their shop or something like this. There's a whole range of examples where touch is a really powerful, subtle social cue, as well as the more expressive, I suppose, explicit cues we might see, like someone giving us a hug or something like that, right?
Yeah, it was making me think of when you're at a loss for words, where you just, in the silence, that the touch speaks the volume.
Yeah, it does.
That
Yeah. So I mean, sometimes words just can't quite get the message across, right? But a simple, comforting touch can do that, right? If and I think particularly for a lot of people, I think they will think about that in situations of support and care, right? In those moments where it's a difficult scenario, maybe you don't have the words, but there's something about touch that can ground us and connect us to one another and help to kind of get that message of, I suppose, calmness and care across.
So I'd be remiss if I don't bring up this specific family issue.
Sure.
In the Dial household, where I've been identified as someone who tends to touch too much.
Okay.
When it comes to dinners, my neighbors, I will touch them as I'm talking. I'm very sort of touchy-feely as it comes to that. At the same time, I'm called out for not being very bisou, which means not often giving kisses, and cuddly. Is that a condition, Michael?
not that I'm aware of. I think you kind of probably reflect on the fact that we all have different touch personas, right? We have different levels of tactility, and even that's not the easiest way to define it, because you might have someone who touches a lot in the house but won't touch a lot outside of the house, right? There's nuance, because touch is not just about what we maybe naturally have as our tendencies. It is influenced by our context, by all these different things. And then you have different types of touch behaviors, right? You can have somebody who will describe themselves as incredibly tactile, a really tactile person, but they might just hate it if someone, I don't know, gives them a hug or strokes their arm or something like that, which another person might say, well, that's my favorite tactile experience. Touch, it is a sense that it unites us, but it also divides us, right? Both in opinions and in other ways as well.
Yeah, in this particular case, massage is the counterpoint. Touchy-feely, but don't like massage.
Yeah.
So interesting. Let's focus on the last part of our chat about what's happened over the last few years. Obviously, you did that study right before lockdown.
Yeah.
My observation, Michael, and this is sort of non-scientific, hopefully somewhat sociological at some level. The observation I have is that the impact of the pandemic was a heightening of our sanitization or making things clean, and social distancing, wearing masks and gloves. E-commerce is great, so we don't have to go to a shop, pay with a phone, so we don't have to touch cash, the dirtiness. It feels like we've had a kind of a titanic move away from touch. And what are your readings on that, and how is that good, and what should we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I found the pandemic somewhat paradoxical in a way, and the reason for that is I think to a degree you're right. I think it has heightened a move to a slightly more touchless society, and I think that certainly has played out in all sorts of examples, right? We're seeing more and more like touchless touchscreens and even things like this now coming out, right? And that was a trend that was there before the pandemic, but I think often seismic events speed trends up, actually. So I think increasingly we're seeing that play out. But on the flip side, I mean, one of the things that we asked people in our survey, and the context of the survey was we asked about 40,000 people from 112 countries worldwide, in this survey just before the pandemic, not knowing it. But we asked about, do you get enough touch in your life? And actually 54% of people, which was the majority, said they didn't. Only 4% of people said they got too much. As we went through the pandemic, other research came out showing 80% of people were saying they weren't getting enough touch in their lives. So there was something paradoxical about it, in that we were going increasingly touchless, but people were saying, I'm not getting enough touch in my life. And I do think there's a part of the pandemic that has also brought people out of it, where there's a new appreciation for those, I suppose, socially supportive components of touch that matter to an individual. And that doesn't necessarily have to be publicly on the street, right? It might be, I missed that hug from my friend that I used to get, right? And now I'm making sure, and I appreciate that a bit more now. Or maybe it was because I couldn't hug my parents, right? And so I think there's subtleties in it, insofar as, yes, we probably are going increasingly touchless in certain scenarios, but I also think there's an appreciation now of touch for people who actually were like, well, actually, no, I missed that when it was taken away. I missed the ability to touch a product in a shop and hold it. For some people will have been a thing, right? So I think that is there. So there's different dynamics to it, but no doubt, there is no doubt, I suppose, that we are becoming increasingly touchless in our interactions. I think that is a challenge that we do face. I say a challenge, but it's also create some opportunities as well, because if you work in a tech space, how can you give these people that are missing touch in their life a sense of touch, right? And
well, send in the machines.
And I think that is increasingly an area of big focus now around, what people call haptic wellness, right? It's this idea of how you can use technology to provide a sense of touch to people. And that could be saying to someone, right, you've got a wearable on your body that vibrates, let's say on your wrist, sends you a message. And that could be somebody trying to send you a comforting squeeze of your arm, because they're not there with you, but that I'm sending it to you. So there's a meaning behind it. I mean, that's one example. Some people are doing work now with social robots, right? So they're building these companion pets.
In Japan, a lot,
right? Yeah, exactly, right. And or even a cushion that you can hold that might breathe with you, right? That's something we've been developing in Bristol. So there's all these things that are in development, just trying to find ways, because not everyone can have touch in their lives. Not everyone has got that person, right? But touch does have a really important impact on people's health and their well-being. It's a very calming sense to ground a lot of people, and maybe a hug from someone else isn't going to do that for someone. Maybe they would prefer that sense to come from something more machine or inanimate, right?
Well, so my line of questioning, as I talked about in my book about empathy and AI, is that it's all very well delegating empathy to the machine, but is that really the right thing to do? Because maybe we have a statement or a position as to whether hugging, shaking hands, kissing, smelling each other actually is the better version of humanity.
And a really important part in that is, we don't know if those machine types of touch actually will carry the same benefits, right? So there is a lot of evidence now showing, for instance, that having supportive hugs from somebody, like physically supportive hugs from another person, or even hugging yourself, can be really beneficial to buffer your responses against stressful situations. If you have these hugs before you get sick, it might actually impact how quickly you recover from a virus as well.
You mentioned that in the book about how touch is actually salutary. It can help you with your immunity.
It can do all these things. And so there's this evidence on physical contact, right, in that. Now, more and more now, people are saying, well, how about if we send somebody a virtual hug? What if someone puts, I don't know, a vest on that they can feel a hug sent from miles away? And we don't know. I mean, we don't know if that will help in the same way as a physical hug will, right? On the one hand, you could say, well, it shows social support, and we know that showing social support plays a role, but that doesn't explain all of the ways in which hugging can help our health and our well-being. So there is something about the physical contact. And, I think there's this question of, are we going to, is digital touch ever going to fully replace human tactile interaction? I don't immediately think it will, because I do think there is something special about human physical contact that we. that we crave, and that other animals in in the world crave, right? So I think we see it on so many levels, and touch has been with us for so long in so many ways. Even something like a handshake. I mean, you look at how long that's been around, and people are like, well, that might disappear post-COVID. It's back. It's not, maybe not as common as it was before. Maybe people get confused should they fist bump, but there's still something tactile, right, connected to it.
Well, my feeling is positionally that we better stay messy, because messy is dirty, messy is not easy, and the not easy, the imperfect, the dirt, that actually is what we're about, and dealing with that. And if we delegate everything, sanitize everything,
Yeah.
I don't feel like that's a world really interesting to live in.
Yeah. Where does those that grounding and connection to our world and our environment come from? And those opportunities, I think, drive innovation, right? Because I think being connected to yourself, others, and the world around you, that's how we've created over the years as a species, right? So what if we lose that, then that becomes quite concerning, right?
And there's plenty of material that talks about how technology is accelerating at paces that are far beyond our ability as human beings to evolve. And so maybe the role here is to somehow slow down the evolution, or at least put our feet down, like a dog who doesn't want to go, and stop the leash pulling me towards this in an ineluctable, sanitized, machine-led world.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's a beautiful way to put it, really.
It was just an image that came to my mind. Michael, what are you working on in the future? What is something that, give us a view into the future of Michael Banissy's work?
Yeah, so I mean, we're doing my work has always been really varied. I should probably say that. So we are continuing with our work on touch. We're doing a lot of work now, actually trying to do some of those comparisons about digital and physical touch. Right? When do they help our health and well-being in the same way? Do they carry those components? But alongside that, we're doing work looking at things like sleep now increasingly. So we're looking at how does touch prior to bed, how that could be a cuddle, that could be all sorts of different components. How do those impact sleep, and how does that then play forward? And looking at other areas, as I kind of alluded to, I suppose, in a conversation. I mean, we've done lots of work over the years on empathy. We're doing a lot more work now on listening. We're really becoming quite interested in listening as a sense that we use, and very much in that kind of conversational way, and affection more broadly. This is a big part of what we're interested in, because there's now, the work on touch for us has mainly been about sharing affection and affectionate touch, but you can share affection in many ways, right? You might write somebody a note, you might send them a message, you could make them a coffee. Yeah, make them a coffee in the morning, smile, right? And the data is now increasingly coming in to show that actually giving affection to someone can almost be as good as receiving affection.
Back to the touched and
right?
the touchy.
So we're really becoming quite interested in this as a topic of investigation. And yeah, so it's a whole mixed bag, really, as well as some slightly kind of unusual stuff in there, like trying to understand experiences like ASMR, which is where people kind of get these kind of tingles from hearing repetitive movements or whispers. So yeah, nice blend.
Well, I just had on my podcast a man who wrote How We Listen his name is Oscar Trimboli, and obviously I was also I mispronounced the name of your book, Why We Touch, because it made me think of Why We Sleep, which is also a great book.
Yeah.
And so a couple of times, I misquoted your book as Why We Touch. It's really when we touch. Handshakes, hugs, high fives, the new science of why touch matters. Michael, been a total pleasure listening to you. I feel touched. And how can people follow your work, get your book? What are the best ways to be in touch with you? I know you have a few good links, so good time to plug out everything.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, everything's on my website, which is www.banissy.com, which is an unusual name. So it's Banissy. And there's a page on there specifically about the books, and you can go through the landing page there if you want to order the books anywhere. But there's updates on all the work that we're doing available on that as well.
Brilliant. keep up the good work, and hopefully we will get a chance to maybe hug in person, or at
Yeah,
least shake a hand, as it feels right to do. Thank you so much, Michael.
pleasure. Thank you for having me.